Age of Sigmar has a lot of factions, and it can be very difficult to decide which one you want to play. So to help you make that choice, I'm going to be covering all of the factions in this series so that you can answer the question, should I play this faction? Today we're going to be talking about the Kharadron Overlords, who just had a brand new battletome released, as well as some brand new models, making this an excellent time to get into the faction. On top of that, the playstyle of the army is changing, and it's becoming a more friendly army for your opponents to play against, but more on that later. The Kharadron Overlords are dwarves that were left behind during the Age of Chaos, when much of the forces of Order retreated to the realm of Azir to bide their time. With their mountain holds no longer safe, the Overlords looked to the skies, creating incredible technology to create flying ships, ports, and entire cities. And these dwarves, they have guns, they have balloons, and they have incredibly rad airships. So let's not waste any more time and get right into the awesome details. The plan for this video is to break down the common questions about the faction, the playstyle, the types of models, and how you might get started in the army, and more. To start the video off, we're going to talk about the playstyle of the Kharadron Overlords. The Kharadron are one of the smaller factions in Age of Sigmar, so you're not going to have a lot of different models to choose from, but you still have a good selection of playstyles and choices that you can make with multiple strategies to playing the faction. But just so you know, having a few of the ships will be essential. So to understand the faction abilities and the resulting playstyle for the Kharadron Overlords, we need to talk about the airships. There is a small ship, the gun hauler, a medium ship, the frigate, and the big ship, the ironclad. Each of these ships have a transport capacity, a number of models that they can pick up and carry to different locations on the battlefield. At the start of a match, you can put your ships into the skies with accompanying units that fit into their carrying capacity, and then during one of your turns, you have the option to bring them down onto the battlefield, potentially to get the jump on your opponent, flanking them or grabbing an important objective. Basically, it means you don't have to deploy all of your models at the start of the match. They can come out at different parts of the game. During your movement phase, you can also use the ship's movement to pick up surrounding units, dropping them off at the end of your move. This means that the Kharadron Overlords have some pretty incredible mobility. They do also have flying dwarves with balloon mechanisms that are pretty quick, but it's important to remember that these are dwarves and that anyone on foot without a ship or a balloon is only going to move 4 inches, which is very, very slow. Maximizing these transportation abilities is going to be a big part about how you get the most out of this army. The Kharadron Overlords have other bonuses when using different ships. When you are within the specific range, I think it's 6 inches of a frigate or an ironclad, for example, your enemies will have -1 to their hit rolls on attacks that target your dwarves. There are also ship-specific bonuses as well. For example, the gun hauler can pull units out of combat to safety, and the frigate can help your dwarves charge into combat. The Kharadron Overlords have a history of their playstyle changing every time they get a new battletome, and from what I understand, this is because it's very difficult to balance a high mobility army that has a lot of shooting. In Age of Sigmar, shooting is not very common. Some armies don't even have it, and others don't use the shooting even if it is one of the options in their army lists. It can be frustrating for your opponent to want to charge you and get into melee combat, but you're flying around taking very long shooting phases, shooting down their forces before they ever even get to do anything cool. So the new book does address that with less movement shenanigans for the Kharadron Overlords and simplified shooting profiles to speed up the shooting phase. There are more melee options than ever before, and the boats have a 2+ save now, which means that they can tank some pretty serious hits. I am not a Kharadron expert, but I do think if you're going to be looking into getting into this army, you do need to do your research and maybe talk to some Kharadron Overlord players on Reddit or Discord to see if the army is for you. Players are still figuring out the new playstyle for this army, but I do think now it's more fun than it ever has been for opponents to play against a Kharadron Overlord's army. With that disclaimer out of the way, let's talk a little bit about how army customization options can affect the way that you play Kharadron Overlords. This army has 4 different battle formations in the new battletome, and they allow you to change the style of your army ever so slightly. One of the formations is focused on making your gun haulers better transport units by increasing their carrying capacity. Another formation protects some of your balloon boys by giving them a defensive ward. A third ability choice will give some of your heroes, or one of your heroes, an extra artifact to carry, and you can pick this after you see your opponent's army, which means that you can tech against them before the game starts, which is very handy. Finally, if you want to go with infantry, you can make the Arcanaut Company models stalwart defenders by decreasing the rend of the enemies attacking them if you fulfill specific conditions. I would be remiss if I had failed to mention that the Kharadron Overlords have 0 magic in their army. There are no wizards, no priests, just machinery. They do have ways to interact with enemy wizards, and they have some anti-manifestation tech, but overall this is a very physical group of dwarves, and if you wanted more magic in your games, you're going to need to look somewhere else. Next, we're going to talk about the last update for the faction and the model range overall. So the Kharadron Overlords are one of the smaller factions, and they don't get a ton of support in the game. They only have 9 heroes, 3 ships, and 6 infantry models. However, with the new book, they received some new heroes and a very cool faction terrain called the Zonteri Engine Dock. This terrain piece will heal your boats, and it will also summon little auto engines which fly around and mess around with your opponents in various ways. There's also a brand new anti-wizard hero called the Null Chemist. This hero deals double damage to all wizards and priests and manifestations, and has a protective aura that shields your allies from magic. There's also a new dual kit that can be built as a Von Grimm Harpoon crew or as a Von Grimm Salvager. These are more balloon dwarves that have high movement, but unlike the Endrin Riggers and the Sky Wardens, they have a little bit less defense, a little less firepower, but more utility for either screening your army or by buffing your other Kharadron Overlords units. Let's take a moment to talk about all the other models that you can look forward to building and painting for your Kharadron Overlord army. We'll start with the heroes. First up, we have several named heroes such as Brock Grungson, Lord Magnate of Barak-Nar, and Dreki Flint. Aside from them, there are plenty of unnamed heroes. Your heroes on foot are the Endrin Master with Aether Harness, the Aether Chemist, the Code Wright, the Etheric Navigator, and the Arcanaut Admiral. Meanwhile, there are some flying heroes like the Endrin Master with the Dirigible Suit and the Null Chemist. By the way, Brock Grungson is a flying hero and Dreki Flint is a hero that is on foot. And this is an important distinction because the foot units have 4 inches of movement and the balloon units have 12 inches of movement. This is a lot of heroes, and they all bring different buffs and synergies with the different parts of the army, and so depending on which type of infantry and non-heroes you want to bring, you're going to bring different heroes. For the non-hero models, we have the Arcanaut Company, which is your basic foot troops. They come in units of 10. Then we have the Grunstock Thunderers, which are a ranged gunner unit, which has some good new utility in the new book. They are in units of 5. We then move on to our Balloon Boys, starting with the OGs, the Endrin Riggers, and the Sky Wardens. They come in units of 3 and have 3+ saves and some decent damage. Finally, as I mentioned earlier, there's the 2 new units of Balloon Boys, the Von Grimm Harpoon Crew and the Von Grimm Salvagers, which come in units of 5. It is important for me to mention the unit sizes because they relate to the carrying capacity of the ships. The Gun Hauler, which is your small boat, can carry up to 1 unit that has 5 models max. This means it couldn't take an infantry unit and a hero. It means it also can't take reinforced Sky Wardens or other Balloon Boys because that would be 6 models. And so this is where the battle formation comes in handy, as it lets you bring 6 models but also 2 units, so you can bring the reinforced unit or bring the hero and somebody else, which greatly increases its transport flexibility. There's also the frigate, which can take 2 units and up to 12 models, and the biggest ship, the Ironclad, can take 3 units and up to 22 models. I'm not going to do a deep dive into the lore of Kharadron Overlords in this video, but if you are curious about their lore, consider checking out my Every Age of Sigmar faction explained in 24 minutes video for an introduction to the faction. From what I've seen online in discussions or on some tier lists, the Kharadron Overlords are going to be on the easier side of the spectrum of factions to paint. Partly this is because there are fewer models in each unit, so it's not going to take up a lot of time. There isn't a lot of skin to paint, and metal features heavily in the KO miniatures, and so it's pretty easy to go hard with metallic paints and then work on some details and trim after. Some people have described slap chopping the Kharadron Overlords models, which you can look up that term if you're interested in what that means. As with any faction, though, painting can be as complex as you make it, and the Kharadron Overlords will provide any painter with a lot of challenging models if you are up for it. Of course, when you paint your boats, they're going to be really massive models with tons of details and a lot of little things to get right, and so those will be more challenging than doing your basic Arcanite Company. Next, we'll talk about where the Kharadron Overlords fall on the scale of Elite to Horde Army. They're definitely not a Horde army, as the unit sizes are much smaller than average, but the Kharadron Overlords have some pretty good stats. Specifically, in the average save on a stat of a Kharadron Overlords unit is pretty decent. They don't have high health values to make them really a defensive force, but we'll talk more about the stats and dwarf stats and the army stats soon, so you'll see what I mean. Basically, they're not an elite army, but they're kind of in the middle there. They're not a Horde army either. I'd like to talk about the price of buying your first 2,000 points of Kharadron Overlords, and it's really difficult to do this for a few reasons. One is that the entire army just shook up in a way that with other armies doesn't happen, and that means that lists are going to change. So I don't want to show you any previous tournament lists. Now, I also want to mention that it's actually very difficult to find KO tournament lists because they just don't place in that many tournaments. Part of that is just the way that their rules have been designed, and they're a really tricky faction to play. It definitely takes a high skill level to get the most out of their movement shenanigans, especially the last book, or the index had some pretty crazy moves that it could do, but you really need to know like your measurements and your movement around the table. But basically what I've done here is I took a bunch of army lists that I could find from previous tournaments, and I priced those out to find out how much a army would cost for 2,000 points. And so what I got was from about $750 to $950 Canadian, which is about $550 to $700 American. And so that's not terrible. That's like pretty reasonable for a full army, but there's actually some pretty good value in the boxes for the Kharadron Overlords. So if you get the new Spearhead, that's going to come with an Engine Master in the dirigible suit, but also 5 Gunstock Thunderers, which I think is basically, you want 5 or 10 of those, but reinforced. Like you don't need more than that. You get a Gun Hauler, and then you get 3 Engine Riggers, which you're probably going to have a lot of those. Then you could buy the new Regiment of Renown, which just came out, which has Drecky Flint, a frigate, and then 10 Archanaut Company miniatures. So right there, you've got 2 different boats and then a bunch of staples to start your army with. And the value there is really high. You're getting these models for significantly cheaper than if you price them out individually. If you can go and search for the Kharadron Overlords Vanguard, you will find the old Spearhead. You'll find the old box. And that one's pretty decent too, because it comes with an Archanaut Admiral, an Archanaut Frigate, but then 3 Engine Riggers and 10 Archanaut Company Warriors. And you might even find that for a cheaper price depending on where you look. So if you're able to get 2 boxes, then I'd go new Spearhead and old Spearhead. But otherwise, you could go with that Regiment of Renown, which is a limited time box from what I understand, which it is really cool because you get Drecky Flint. But either way, I think those pair really well together. I wouldn't necessarily buy doubles of any of the boxes. If there was one that I was going to buy a double of, though, I think the Spearhead makes sense because 2 gun haulers is more reasonable to fit into an army list than 2 frigates, although I'm sure you can do 2 frigates, and it does let you then reinforce your Engine Riggers or Sky Wardens, and it lets you reinforce your Gunstock Thunderers, which again, you're only going to run 1 unit of a lot of the time because their new super techie ability is once per army, which means multiple units won't get to use their new ability. Now we're going to talk about the general stats that you might see in this faction, and I'm discussing averages here, so what I say might not hold true for every single specific unit in this army, but it will just give you a general idea of what you might expect if you're going to get into this faction. So normally you might see dwarves like hit on 4s and wound on 3s, but it kind of varies literally all over the map here, but the book is all over the place. And so most non-heroes are going to hit on some combination of a 4-3 or a 3-4 profile. That's a decent profile, but anytime you have to roll a 4, it will be difficult. It's not elite stats, which would be 3-3s. It's a step back from that. A lot of the infantry are on 3+ saves, and those that aren't are on 4+ saves, which is fantastic. This is a very high average for an army, and it means that you do have a little bit more durability, but you don't have the health necessarily to back that up that like a truly defensive army might have. Many of your heroes are going to hit on 3s and wound on 3s. Like I said, that's great. And then that's paired with most of them having a 3+ save. I think all of them having a 3+ save as well. So they're all durable, but again, they're heroes, so they don't have a ton of health. As previously mentioned, for the dwarves, if they're on foot, you have a 4-inch move, and then the balloon dwarfs have a 12-inch move. Your ships have really interesting stats as they have decent health, although it did go down from the last book, but you have a 2+ save characteristic, which is incredibly rare. The ships have some serious firepower as well, with 3 damage on their main cannons. They hit on 4s, they wound on 2s, so you do want to all-out attack that or buff that in some way. Their ranged shots, like I said, they deal very high damage, but they cannot shoot in combat. The melee profile for the ships is not very strong, and there is no rend on them, so they really won't do that much damage. They hit on 4s and then they wound on 4s. So if a ship gets into combat, it might tie up an enemy unit pretty well because they have very good defense, but you're going to lose access to one of your highest, if not the highest, like single damage value in the army. Luckily, the Kharadron Overlords have multiple mechanics to help certain units retreat and still be allowed to shoot after, and so you'll have to bring specific heroes to grant those buffs, but that can all wait for when you start building your first list. I think generally though, whenever you do charge a ship in, especially if it is a frigate, which allows other units to come with it and charge, the idea is that you want to blow up whatever you're charging so that you can reposition and shoot again in the future. And that's going to be it for this video. I hope that this video has helped you decide whether or not Kharadron Overlords is going to be your first ever, or maybe just your next army that you are going to play. And KO veterans, let me know if I missed any information that you want to share with prospective Kharadron Overlord players. This faction is a little bit more rare to see on the table. There's not as many KO players as there are for other factions. And so if you do get into this faction, you're going to be a very unique person at your Warhammer club. And sure, there might be other KO players there, but it is cool to take on a task like that, especially when the army doesn't have a ton of support and is constantly changing. If that's something that worries you, then maybe you do, like I said, go talk to a KO player first to get the lowdown on the army and even try to potentially play the army on Tabletop Simulator or borrow someone's army at your local store. But either way, thanks for watching. Let me know what you think and if you're thinking about getting into KO. Otherwise, I'll see you all in a future video.